I've already debunked the claim that third-party games aren't doing well on Nintendo Switch 2 because they clearly are. There's a number of success stories on the console, a lot of which people will acknowledge. But I do think it's time to take a look at the elephant in the room and address the real issue. The thing that the gaming journalists won't address is that third parties did not put their best foot forward on this console, right? Everything they put out were late ports, they were lazy, they were overpriced, right? All of that is true. Now, they still sold because, people have been wanting these games on Nintendo consoles for years, but the reality of the situation is that all of these games were all games that really should have launched on Switch 1, right? And there are still plenty of games like the new Monster Hunter or Dragon's Dogma 2 or Final Fantasy 16, 14, 15, that 13 even, that are still nowhere to be found on Nintendo consoles. They're just not existent. And it really doesn't matter, and it's really not impacting the sales of the console at all because these aren't games that anybody really cares about or would pick up again on Nintendo Switch. But I do think third parties tried their typical tricks when it comes to these new Nintendo console releases, where they release a bunch of shovelware with minimal upgrades, with a handful of tweaks, and when the game fails, they tell their investors that their audience isn't on Nintendo consoles and they never put anything else on there, right? This has been a go-to cope for them for entire console generations now, right? They did it in the Wii U era. Actually, the Switch 2 is very similar to the Wii U in that regard, but the major difference now is that Nintendo's brand is so much stronger than it was back then. PlayStation and Xbox have completely collapsed. That this observation that people have that oh, Mario Kart, it's the only game Nintendo has. First of all, that's not true. And second of all, even if it was, it would still do well anyway. Compared to the Switch 1 launch, the Switch 2 is loaded with stuff to play, right? It's kind of shocking how the Switch 2 is clearly blatantly better than the Switch 1 launch in a lot of ways, and how clearly we are geared for a Nintendo Direct coming up, and how we have this wider range of games that you can out anytime, and you're still seeing people try and say it's not good enough, that there aren't enough games. Mario Kart World by itself is selling consoles. Everything else, it doesn't really matter. And I suppose, this is, the big issue that people are having going forward is that they're beginning to realize that, the big third-party games are no longer, these huge blows against Nintendo. Because absolutely none of them, aside from maybe Grand Theft Auto, are in any way, driving people to their platforms, right? Final Fantasy Final Fantasy 16 not being on Nintendo consoles isn't going to discourage anyone to not play it, because Nintendo has Pokemon, it has Xenoblade, it has Fire Emblem, all of which are better than Final Fantasy ever was in a lot of ways. But Square fans have slowly become associated closely with Nintendo fans because of games like Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler. The best games that Square have put out in recent years have been low effort, traditional JRPGs on a low budget on Nintendo hardware. And so, their Bravely Default re-release has actually been fairly successful. Even though I'm certain of the fact that it was released intentionally to fail. That's the trend we've seen with certain projects The World's Ends With You 2 or Diofield Chronicle. Well, they'll just throw out a title to just have it fail so they can justify their other business moves. This idea that they have to westernize, they have to get rid of turn-based combat systems, and they have to stay off of Nintendo hardware, right? This is the weird industry tactic that they've been getting away with for years, but people are still beginning to wake up to the fact that these companies aren't really worth talking about or noticing. I barely noticed all the games that weren't on Nintendo Switch 2 because I was too busy playing the games that were. Not just the day one releases, but games that came out on Switch One. Like I'm at the point now where I've gone back to playing like a lot of the Switch One games I haven't finished. Like Dragon Quest III and Suikoden and stuff like that. Like I feel as if like this idea that third-party games aren't doing well on Switch 2 is a giant cope, especially when you take into consideration just how many of these games are also releasing on Switch 1. Like, I do think that's like the big issue I have with this narrative that like third-party games aren't selling on Switch 2. Well, like, Fantasy Life launched on Switch 1. It became a bestseller on both platforms. Suikoden launched on Switch 1. Like, you have like Tony Hawk is launching on Switch 1. Shadow Labyrinth is launching on Switch 1. Right? Like, again, how the game performs on Switch 2 really doesn't matter. Like, even Nintendo is putting out, like, Switch 1 games for the foreseeable future, for the next year at least. Like, they aren't in a rush to, like, bring people over to their new platform. And this has been a glaring omission in data analysts and just general industry cope. They specifically don't want to acknowledge that people are still buying and playing games on Nintendo Switch 1 and will continue to do so in the future. Not only did Nintendo Switch 2 break sales records and introduce a highly successful new game to the Mario Kart series, Nintendo Switch 1 still stayed on the market. It's still selling units. It's still selling new games, and it's still like featuring a number of cross features with Nintendo Switch 2, right? All of which are things that like nobody really wants to talk about and acknowledge, because the reality of the situation is the big cope in regards to Nintendo Switch this console generation has been this idea that like, oh, Nintendo consolidated their console brands and now they got rid of their dying handheld console brands, and now they only have a handheld. If you take into consideration the fact that the Wii and DS were separate platforms, they were far more successful than the Switch was alone. Like, you had people coping with that, like, and like they never really caught on to the fact that the 3DS was still relevant throughout a good chunk of the Switch's early years, and now the Switch 2 will be relevant all throughout the Switch 1's later years. So again, Nintendo still has multiple platforms on the market. They've demonstrated how they're going to handle console transitions going forward. The majority of Switch 1 games have transitioned onto Switch 2. You do keep the games you buy on those consoles tied to your account. All of these things are becoming very, very apparent, and the industry is still desperately trying to keep up this narrative that Nintendo Switch is on the verge of failing, or that people are disappointed with the games. I've heard all sorts of weird things, like this idea that people are buying the console and are returning it without opening it, which is why the sales numbers are so high, but why the software sales are so low. It's just a giant cope, and that's going to become more apparent as we see this console continue to succeed. I imagine by the time the next Nintendo Direct drops, you are going to see zero. Well, actually, we're already at that point. Yeah, like right now, there is just zero doubt. There is just no doubt. There is no cause to think that the Nintendo Switch 2 is failing, or that third-party games are struggling. But that's going to become more apparent once the Nintendo Direct drops and we get like some more information about what we can expect in the next 6 months to a year, right? Like this is my thing. Looking at this situation and seeing how things are going to develop from here, because like we already have a loaded 2025, and yet like the gaming community is going to do everything it possibly can to try and cope and seethe and try to pretend that PC gaming is superior, and all of it is going to fall apart by the time like Animal Crossing or Splatoon gets announced. It's going to be phenomenal. Like, again, people have noticed this, but it's worth pointing out, we don't have a 3D Mario game. Mario Wonder was the big Mario game of this console generation, and it's been like, it's available on Switch 2. People are going to be picking it up. I would be shocked if the game doesn't sell like another 10 million units in the next like 5 years or so. But the game was hugely successful in spite of all the all the cope and seething. Actually, that's a good point. Actually, Tears of the Kingdom has already demonstrated that it's had like this huge resurgence after like the re-release of this, after the release of this console, right? With the upgrade pack and like it's been like one of the go-to like day one games for a lot of people because like if you skipped out in the game the first time, like this is now's a good time to pick it up. So with that being said, with all that being said, and everything like that we do need to address, like, how do you think this is going to end, really? Because like the simple fact of the matter is, you did not need third-party games on the Switch 2 to make it successful, right? Third parties did everything they possibly could to sabotage this release, as they always did. Capcom threw Monster Hunter, their most successful IP, at PlayStation and Xbox and PC. They made this huge deal about how PC was going to be their primary platform going forward, and it failed. Like Square did the same thing, they failed. Third parties aren't like this major draw to consoles anymore. Like, because they're available and everything, they're low quality. Like, the good ones you can just buy when they're, like, on sale on Nintendo consoles, like, 5 years after release. Like, there's no reason to get excited about third-party games. Like, Nintendo games are worth getting excited about. They are worth picking up hardware for, and this console release has been very exciting for a lot of people. And right now, there's a lot of coping and seething, denying that is the case.